I could give you 30, 40 reasons why China will not be in existence as a unified nation state. But really, this is the single most important. It's the islands that roughly parallel the Chinese coast: Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore. It's not just that they're all allies, although they are. It's that they form something that the Chinese call the first island chain. And the Chinese have never, in any period of their 3,500-year-long history, ever been able to penetrate that chain in a commercial manner and integrate economically with the world beyond. There is one exception under the order, because the Americans have forced everyone to be on the same side. But if you remove the Americans from the equation, this region goes back being more antagonistic. And China has lacked its entire history the military capacity to enforce any sort of globe-spanning trade system. In fact, any sort of East Asian-centric trade system. All the Americans have to do, if the goal really is to destroy China, is go home. Now, I said there are 30 to 40 reasons. I'm going to give you a couple more. Let's look at demographics. Now, this is the Chinese demographic in 1980. You'll notice it's very young. And when China joined the order, they were able to produce goods at a price that no one could compete with because they had so many young people, supply and demand. But if you fast forward 20 years, it looks a little bit different. Between 1980 and 2015, China experienced the perfect demographic moment. And there were three pieces to it. First, they had lots of young people, so low production costs. That was over 20 years ago. And Chinese labor costs since 2000 have increased by more than a factor of 10. Second, Chinese young adults had few kids, with higher spending in the short run. That's the Chinese boom that we've seen these last 10 years, but that's nearly over. There's a consumption trough. And third, China cannibalized the countryside to fuel urban activity, and that's over. The countryside is now nearly empty of people of reproductive age. In many ways, the Chinese development story is a bit like what happened here in the United States with the move from the farm to the city. But whereas in the United States it happened over 2 centuries, in China it happened in just 1 generation. So here's the Chinese demography today. They are enjoying one last burst of consumption before that one block of population ages into not being significant consumers. And they've not only aged out of their beautiful demographic moment, the Chinese have aged past the point of demographic recovery. And it shows up in their labor data. These are several Southeast Asian countries that I think will actually do pretty well in the world we're moving into. This is Mexico, a country with very competitive. And here's the labor costs in the People's Republic of China. They have simply moved past the point where they can participate in a meaningful trade system. In fact, if you look at the consumption numbers, it's really, here is domestic car sales month by month from a year earlier. Now that big drop off in January of 2000, that's from the coronavirus pandemic. That is what you would expect when people don't go outside, they don't buy cars. That's not what I talk about. What I'm talking about when I'm talking about the trouble that China is in. I'm looking at the 2 years previous. Look at how negative that is. Now, this is pre-COVID. This is in 2019. This is in 2018. This is when the big story was how China was going to take over everyone and rule the world and be a big consumption-led economy. It's just that it's not true. Even within their own system, even with their own data, China has already gone. They also have a shorter-term trade talks. Lighthizer has been in charge of all the trade talks everywhere in the world, wherever they happen to be. Now, this is the guy who wrote the World Trade Organization Charter. This is arguably the most free trade person in the American political establishment today. Put this more short term, this gentleman, Ambassador Branstad from Iowa, used to be the governor. He is arguably the person in the United States most capable of generating a positive working relationship with the Chinese because he's on a first name basis with President Xi Jinping of China. Branstad and Xi have been friends since they first met in 1985. And so when Trump appointed Branstad to be ambassador, everybody assumed that things were going to go swimmingly. Well, after months of relations deteriorating, Branstad last week wrote an op-ed about how the relationship was falling apart and what the Chinese had done to push it in that direction. Chinese, of course, immediately censored the document, and Branstad resigned. Chinese are completely dependent on high tech from other sources. Now, I'm sure that you have heard the Made in China 2025 program, the idea that China is seeking technological parity with the United States in just 5 years. If you talk to any Chinese bureaucrat, look behind closed doors where their minder is not listening, it'll become pretty obvious to you that 2025 is really just the first step. They don't expect true parity until at least 2070. They don't have that kind of time. Now, some version of this holds true. Obviously, especially in manufacturing, the US is very well positioned for the low end. The shale revolution and low transport costs to end consumers bodes very well for American low-end manufacturers. And the US is also well positioned on the high end. The US has the capital, the tech, and the labor force. And within manufacturing, there are two subsectors that are very heavily exposed to this. The first is automotive. What about 2/3 of that is within NAFTA? That's manageable. Bigger concern is the second one, technology manufacturing. About 2/3 of that is in East Asia. And we'll come back to that in just a minute. First, we have to have an idea of the decision-making process here. If this were just about energy and markets and transport, resources and finance, everybody would be handing to the, but it's not. It's also about coronavirus. No one knows precisely how long the pandemic will last or in what order will end, and this graphic gives you an idea of why. You can see the United States, the blue line, has never really recovered from our first wave, and we're already starting to gear up for something worse. The European Union did recover from their first wave, but they're already back to their first wave highs and are actually seeing a number of states like Spain that are already suffering new infection rates that are worse than what we have here in the United States. The Middle East and the Latin American countries are on the whole as bad or worse than what's going on here in the United States. So you've got to decide what matters. If you were already looking to escape from China in 2019, whether it's because of human rights or information security or the police state or what's going on in Hong Kong or the genocide in Xinjiang, coronavirus only confirms your decision and you accelerate your own extraction. But if you were hanging on due to sunk costs, you're probably going to wait to be forced by circumstances or governments. And for the most part, that's the view of Silicon Valley. They have bet their entire existence on globalization. Nearly their entire manufacturing chain is in East Asia, and very little of that is going to last, which means that when they do move, when they are forced to move, it will all move at once. Potential recipient locations who are ready for that can inherit 50 years of supply chain expansion almost overnight, and potential recipient locations who cannot will get nothing.
First of all, it's not so much that jobs get created or destroyed, it's that they change. And it's pretty common when you're dealing with an environment that has evolved because of technology, jobs evolved. We've been talking about technology overwhelming the workforce really since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. It obviously generates changes. We don't all live on subsistence farms. The trick is whether or not the technology evolves faster than our political ability to adapt to the changing workforce conditions. And I would argue that at least at the moment, we're nowhere near that. I mean, yes, we're dealing with the information revolution, and yes, there's the possibility that's going to replace a lot of jobs, increase productivity to the point that a lot of people just don't have anything to do. But that's all theoretical. Our experience in the last 5 years is, if anything, it's going to be the opposite. You see, the sort of things that IT evolutions do is they make it's in the name, information tech. It manipulates information at a faster rate. But that is not where the uneducated people in our society are. Most of the uneducated people in our society are in lower class, blue collar jobs. That is not something that AI can help with at all. That's something that the advances we've seen in productivity are almost irrelevant. AI instead is taking away those low to mid-skilled white collar jobs, which is not normally what we think of when we think about the sort of jobs that would be destroyed. So we've actually, in the last 3 years, seen the greatest increase in take-home pay for low-skilled blue collar workers in over a century. And that is actually helping, in the case of the United States, narrow economic inequality to a degree that we have not seen since before the World Wars. So if anything, the theory is proving itself wrong rather than right. However, if you're, say, a copy editor or a secretary, well, you might have some really big problems because AI already has been able to deal with those jobs in a more efficient manner. You just don't need as many people. In fact, the blockchain, which is one of the things that undergirds crypto, not undermines crypto, is something that could be very transformative in things like healthcare. If you think about any doctor's office you've been in, there's that huge forest of staff in the back who are basically on the phone with the insurance agents every day, all day. Well, the whole idea of blockchain is that anyone who controls half of the pieces can grant others access. Well, in your healthcare records, that would be you. And if everything from that could be digitized, then that entire flood of low-skilled white-collar workers in the back of every doctor's office, hospital simply goes away. So it's probably not going to hit where we think it is, and it's probably not a red versus blue thing. And it's probably not a coastal versus interior. It's mid-levels of education versus the edges. If you're highly educated or low educated, you look fine from this.